Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Everything Went Black podcast. I'd like to thank everyone for listening, leaving reviews, and sharing the episodes. I really appreciate that. Before we get going, I want to take care of some business. Shout out to all the Patreon supporters. Once again, I really appreciate it. Your continued support helps out quite a bit. For those of you who are interested in supporting the podcast on a monthly basis, monetarily, head over to Patreon. If you go to everythingwentblackmedia.com, there'll be a pop-up. There's a portal which will take you over to Patreon, and for as little as $1 a month, you can help support the podcast, allow me to do more stuff, help pay for the bandwidth, all that sort of stuff. And, in exchange, you get some free stuff, which right now I'm working on more stuff. In the past, I've given away audiobooks, rare Tombs demos, stuff like that. And there'll be more things to come. I'm just trying to find time to make some of this content. If you like metal, which some of you I assume do, check out my show on Gimme Radio. It's called The Sacred and Profane. GimmeRadio.com. It's an all-metal 24/7 station. It's got Dave Mustaine, Randy Blythe, a bunch of different, guys doing their own shows. It's a curated format, and every 2 weeks they air my show. It'll be basically a playlist, the greatest hits of that week for me. Old stuff, new stuff, death metal, black metal, hard rock, post-punk, hardcore punk, all kinds of stuff. Pretty much whatever I think is cool, strikes me as something that's worth putting in a playlist, and then there you go. It's available for free. So I believe that you can go to GimmeRadio.com, stream it through your computer, or you can download the app, which is available on the App Store. This podcast is available on pretty much all platforms. You can subscribe via iTunes. You can stream it at everythingwentblackmedia.com. It's on Spotify, Google Play, Mixcloud, pretty much anywhere where you can listen to podcasts. Check us out on all social media accounts: Instagram, everythingwentblack_Mike Hill, Facebook and Twitter, Everything Went Black, or you can check me out as Michael Hill on Facebook. Welcome back, my good friend Aleix Martinez, music PR specialist, DJ, and artist. He'll be joining us for this episode, and we talk about a plethora of topics, including Pride Month, definitions of masculinity, the Misfits Reunion, a couple of Danzig stories, gay biker clubs, and his upcoming DJ night in New York City. So check it out. So you've been working for years in the PR industry, and right now you're working just on you have your own sort of operation going on right now, right?
Yeah. So I have, I guess in 2002, I just started doing PR, and the first band I worked for was The Cramps, and from then on, kind of like prove yourself at the firm I was working at, and it went well. And then I've worked with a lot of people over the years. And about 5 years ago, I kind of set up shop for myself to have more control over a workload, but also kind of like a vision of really focusing on like fringe artists, like left field artists, championing a lot of different queer artists too, which is the great part of it. But as you can imagine, it's always hard to run your own thing when you're championing those kind of ideas.
Yeah, it's definitely like an admirable thing to do what you want to do, but you got to pay them bills, man.
Of course,
I know that.
You got to keep the lights on.
Keep the lights on. But this is Pride Month, and
yes.
Since Everything Went Black podcast is for all walks of life, we're going to celebrate Pride by having my friend Aleix on, who is a gay man.
Thank you so much, Mike, and I appreciate that. I appreciate you sharing your platform with me. And I always tell people diversity doesn't happen by accident. You have to make it happen and share what you have. So I appreciate it.
So one of the things that has been, in the back of my mind, now that we're in Pride Month, is just the sort of corporate. I think there's a term for it too. Sort of exploitation of the gay community to turn it into this sort of revenue stream for them with ads and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, there's a term for that, I think.
I don't know what the term would be, but I always say everyone's chasing that pink dollar. It's not as much of a risky proposition to support queer people as it was years ago. So, very few companies experience a backlash for supporting queer people. It's usually the opposite. And everyone's become aware that they're professional now, have money.
Right.
And it's, queer people are more marginalized. It was harder to have a job and that stream of income. So, it's like when people first identified the teenager as a market, I feel like it's that everyone wants that pink dollar.
So, I mean, how is that generally viewed in the community?
Well, I think that, there's like a kaleidoscope of opinions on it. Personally, someone from the more fringe aspects of it, or someone who just comes from a punk and DIY background, it's always seemed disingenuous to me. I remember, when 20 years ago, when you first started seeing like Pride Water, or things branded with a pink triangle and official sponsors. And so many of these people don't put any real resources into, organizations that house homeless trans youth, that advocate for the rights of gay people in so many parts of the world where it's still illegal, or the states where you can, still lose an apartment over it. So I think more and more people are starting to look at, do you have a real commitment to queer people, or is this something where you're just trying to sell us a product? But they'll always, at the end of the day, if someone makes something that's desirable, a shirt that someone wants to wear, they're not going to think too much about where that money's going. But
yeah, that's something that I've wrestled with too. I mean, not specifically with the gay community, because I can empathize with that. But over the years, growing up, listening to punk and hardcore music and sort of not that I'm a skateboarder, but being involved in that culture through music and the scene or whatever, how, that sort of everything ends up getting co-opted. Anything that's like kind of cool and like on the outside, people may want to sort of vicariously express themselves by wearing a certain tag or ornament that they can just put on and say, okay, check me out, Thrasher, or like have the Black Flag bars, or, I support, whatever. I mean, and that's always been like I said, I agree with you about the appearance of it being disingenuous. Do you think it's damaging at all, though? Like, is there any real, do you see it as like a threat at some point?
Okay, so for society at large, I don't see it as a threat, because I think it's positive. I think it's good for children, for these things to be normalized in a certain way. And it definitely sends the message that gay people aren't, I guess, risky and are just respectable in a certain way. But then there's also the part of me, it's like, I don't want to be respectable. I don't need respectable to you. I spent my whole life being disrespected for who I am, and I've never needed your respect. I've had to make my life so I'm happy without your respect or anything to do with you. So I do think it does threaten that kind of a queer culture, the feral queer culture, the one that had to grow on the margins. It's almost like a gentrification, where just this seed is planted and then the neighborhood starts changing. So I feel that effect, but some people are all for it. I'm really against it.
With all this corporate sponsorship going on, all this media being put out, there's some key players such as Marsha Johnson that are not being talked about in this conversation. So,
Yeah, no, of course. And I mean, queer history, like a lot of history, it's, the version of it depends on who's telling it. And unfortunately, I feel like gay white men, when a queer person's telling it at all, it's normally gay white men who have their own version of events. But, I think it's any scholar, people, respectable historians of queer history know that Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera were, two of the trans women of color that resisted the police and initiated what became, the Stonewall riots. And it's the most marginalized people often make the biggest contributions to any culture and get erased from it, musically speaking, or that. And that's certainly their story. But that, people think that a bunch of white gay men as we understand them today started that. But really, that was a mafia bar and a mafia hangout, and the most marginalized of people hung out there because there were even gay bars they couldn't go to. And when you have nothing to lose, I guess some people find that courage, and it certainly sparked that around the world. And I'm just happy that you hear the name Marsha P. Johnson more and more. So I think gay history being respected or recorded in any formal way is a really new thing. So I really think that that's something that's going to change in the future.
Now, one of the things, we live in a very troubled time right now. We have Donald Trump in office. It seems like on a daily basis, he's offending people. His rhetoric is offensive to most sensible people out there. Now, this might come off as like a broad statement, but is there like politically, because he's been accused of being homophobic and all this other stuff. Is there any division among the community, like with the gay community?
Well, sadly, yeah, there is. There's certainly not a consensus, even when it comes to someone as horrifying as him. There are plenty of gay Republicans and just gay supporters of him, because I really think that, if you're someone from the upper middle class or wealthy family and you're white, and you're an educated person, which there's no reason you wouldn't be if you had those resources, that simply being gay is really not that marginalized of an identity, and that those people have it pretty good. They have pretty good prospects of it. So they're not gay white men that are professional and from good families are not in danger under Donald Trump the way that a trans person of color is, an illegal immigrant is, any working poor person is. So there have been even almost like Ann Coulter type figures in the gay community that have made careers out of being pro-Trump and gay at the same time and sensationalizing that point of view. But I would think overwhelmingly, most queer people, the overwhelming majority of queer people is completely against Donald Trump, and certainly against Mike Pence, who's even more homophobic.
So what do you think the reason why this sort of like neoconservative upswing in our society, like just in your opinion?
My opinion is that we have access to each other's voices more than ever. So you can kind of listen in on conversations that used to be private. So if, queer people were talking amongst each other, you didn't know what they spoke like or what they talked about. And now because of Twitter and Facebook, you can read those conversations. And the same for people of color and queer people of color. And since people have found a platform and amplified their voices and kind of claimed space and made things happen for themselves, I think there's the perception that straight white people aren't progressing and everybody else is. That it's really hard to accept the fact that people are still trying really hard to get to where you've been just by birth. So I think that that's really it, that people feel their power being threatened, that everyone's getting one over on them, and this is their way of conserving it.
Yeah, recently, listeners of the podcast don't know, as I've been talking about this, but I shot a pilot, and one of the guys I interviewed was this guy, Vegas Tenold, and he wrote a book called Everything You Love Will Burn, and he embedded himself in the sort of white nationalist movement and sort of dealt with some of this stuff too, about like, why, I mean, living in the East Coast, it's like the smallest step to jump up to getting over someone's background, culturally or whatever their orientation are, And so for coming, living in like a metropolitan area like this, it's like I've always been like, well, what the hell? Like, why would anyone have these ideas? Besides from all the unresolved racial issues that people have, but I think that there is this like false sense that people from these typically interior portions of the country are being forgotten and sort of left out, and that's kind of like the backlash to a lot of that stuff.
Oh yeah, my longtime boyfriend is from Oklahoma, and his family's in Oklahoma and Arkansas and Missouri. So I spent a lot of time there the last 8 years, and speaking to people and really trying to be, I guess, almost too Pollyanna about it. Of like, let me share my truth with you, and talk to people about things and open up. And as much as it's been eye-opening for me, and those parts of the country were different from what I envisioned, it's really showed me that we're very disconnected from each other as Americans, and that people in that part of the country have no idea what life is like here in the New York area. They really think no one is, blue collar or working class. Everyone's drinking a fancy cocktail on their way to a big event, that no one is a hard worker. And, I tell them, I'm like, my mom's a security guard. She works a 70-hour week. She's 60 years old, I almost sometimes wish we could have more of an exchange of people from the same social class, like working class people from different parts of the country with each other, because no one's come into the rescue of those people whose lives have been threatened, and there's no manufacturing jobs. These things aren't coming back here. We only have each other. So if we can't, come together and act in our interest and get over that, the people in power, the 1%, is always going to exploit us and keep us divided.
Yeah, and also people on the coast, they assume that people that live in the interior of the countries are, rednecks and, all this other stuff too.
I don't know if I assumed that they were rednecks, but to me, when I first went to Oklahoma City and saw there was like this giant gay neighborhood and gay businesses and that straight people patronize them, and
I've been to Oklahoma City.
Yeah, it blew my mind. It was so much cooler. I mean, I kind of expected it to have like good rock and roll bars. It actually had less than I thought it would, but it has more lesbian bars than Manhattan has. And which is crazy. And so I had a lot of misconceptions about them. But then there's other things that I have to say. I was shocked to be called a Yankee. I never grew up thinking that people from the South or the Midwest or, whatever you want to call those parts of the country were different than me in that way.
That Yankee thing, it's funny. I was telling this story recently. A good friend of mine lives down in Richmond, and this is going back maybe 10 or 15 years. And I was down there visiting, and we were sitting in a restaurant, and he got up to, go to use the restroom, and I overheard a conversation behind me of these two ladies referring to people as Yankees. And I was like, what the hell is this, man? This is like the, the Civil War ended,
Yeah, are there carpetbaggers too? What's going on here?
Yeah, but yeah, it's just like such an odd disconnect that people have with each other, and one of the ironies is that everyone has so much attention put on social media and all this perceived connection that everyone has, but the reality is that there's almost we're lonelier now than we ever were, really, with all this alleged connection that everyone has.
Oh yeah, I mean, we're definitely interacting with someone on a digital platform and being able to relate to them face to face, or building any kind of real community, are such different things. And I agree with you. I really think it's made real connection and true community a lot harder to establish.
So one of the things, there's been this narrative that's been, I'm sort of forced to deal with some of these things, being even though I don't like to read press, or I don't like to really get too involved in music journalism or any of this other stuff, there's this narrative that seems to be percolating about racism and national socialism within like the extreme music world. But I find it interesting that they left homophobia out of the conversation.
Yeah, well, you don't need to go extreme to find the homophobia. But which I always, growing up, that's something that when I was in middle school, before the internet, and when you're trying to find other people who are like you, to me, I was always, just looking for that goth kid or that punk kid, that metal kid. It's like, if you were dressed in all black, I wanted to hang out with you, and I would go up to you and talk to you. And it always shocked me, the homophobia from at least the metal fans that I grew up around in Newark, New Jersey, always shocked me, because I always thought, I'm inherently more metal than you. Like so much more metal than you, because you might not believe in the Bible, or it's a time where everyone's reading the Satanic Bible and doing those things. Satan's big in the late 80s, and I'm like, but I'm inherently profane. Like my very existence is so anti-Christian that you should think that's awesome, that I'm so offensive to Christians, but you don't. And I never understood why. And I always would tell people, I'm like, you know what? Some of these kids are just jocks in all black.
Yeah, I'll have to agree with that. Yeah, it's like, the sort of like hyper masculinization of metal, and the It's always been a little suspect to me too.
All right, I need to say there's nothing more queer or more gay than being hypermasculine. When you look at, Tom of Finland and these things, are these like hyper-masculine imagery, it's totally queer. And in terms of, underground in our subcultures, if I want to kind of trace them historically a little bit to like right after World War II, when biker culture starts, where people come back from World War II and they feel disenfranchised and they don't want to participate in mainstream America, and they start these biker clubs. These biker clubs, the straight and the gay ones, they show up in the same places at the same time. That leather aesthetic, that, like Marlon Brando in The Wild One, leather jacket, that happens at the same time. It's not appropriated one from the other. They're one and the same thing. There were queer bikers all along. And it's the same with metal.
Post World War II?
Yeah. Post World War II is where this whole aesthetic is born. And you can say that everything that, punk aesthetics and goth aesthetics and metal aesthetics become, you kind of trace them back to that and the evolution of that.
Yeah, because I was aware of the post-world, like the Hell's Angels. I mean, there's debate over the origin of the club, but basically my understanding too was that after World War II, these guys came back, most likely suffering from PTSD, and didn't want to fit into society, and they kind of like, that's why there is like sort of like a military regimentation to motorcycle clubs. You have to like prospect, and then you get full patch, and there's all these like hierarchical sort of. But I wasn't aware that there were big gay bike clubs.
Well, but the thing with it too is what's interesting is that World War II, as horrifying as it was one of the in modern America, the first chances that gay men had to meet each other, because they were in these long-term situations around only men. They weren't isolated. So that was one of the first times that queer communities were established, because with so many men, just percentage-wise, X amount had to be gay. And then they'd find each other, and then when the war ends, they of course feel the same way as everyone else does, but they've finally connected with other people who are like them. They're meeting each other for the first time. So it evolves in this other way, but it's kind of one and the same thing in many ways.
Wow, someone should write a book about that. I mean, there's all sorts of like books about Sonny Barger and the Hell's Angels and all the different. That'd be an interesting study to do.
Yeah, there's a great book actually that I recommend to anyone who's interested, and it's called Beyond Shame. I believe it's Reclaiming Radical Gay Sexuality. And it kind of goes into that of, tracing putting historical context to modern queer people, because obviously you're not taught this in school. So I think now everyone's trying really hard to document the oldest gay people you can find to get that history down accurately. So there's a lot of interesting queer oral history projects if you dig around.
That's funny. I just like talk more about the leather scene, because since you mentioned that, Rob Halford, I just saw Judas Priest a couple months ago, and I remember being a young man, and like 12, I think, or a young kid actually, 12, getting into heavy metal, Judas Priest, Rob Halford, leather, right, riding crop, like leather hat, like the whole like, at the time I'm like, it didn't even register, obviously, because I wasn't fully even aware of homosexuality or even my own sexuality as a young boy. And then older kids, in the metal sort of oeuvre, just denying the fact that actually was a gay image. And then years later, Halford comes out as being gay. And there was an uproar, oh my God, I can't believe it. So how could people miss that, like in your opinion?
Well, there's a lot of things. One is the first thing I want to say to everybody is that queer people, gay, lesbian, trans, bi, have been a part of every single musical movement in this country from the very beginning. There is no underground anything that exists without queer people, whether or not they're out, whether or not you know them. That you can trade. There were queer out blues singers. In the 40s, you see like Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith singing songs about love and women. And certainly things like punk and metal, there were queer people in there from the inception. And I think that it seems so difficult to imagine a time when we were more naive, but we didn't have access to each other and each other's history and imagery before the internet. So until you see maybe a Police Academy movie and they go to a leather bar, which is certainly the first time I saw a leather aesthetic was watching a Police Academy movie with my dad.
Sure.
I had no idea what that was. You don't connect it and you don't get it, because I remember being 6 years old in 1984 and seeing Boy George all the time, him being at the height of his fame. I never understood that Boy George was gay. I never thought about that. I didn't get it. One, I didn't know about my own sexuality, but I didn't know much about gay people. I just thought he, like looked awesome like Cyndi Lauper. And for me, I'm 40 years old, so I didn't really start seeing a lot of images of gay people until the AIDS crisis, and those were the images. So I don't know how well versed most people would have been to a leather aesthetic.
Yeah, but Police Academy, that was probably the first time I was aware of the heavy leather scene. But Cruising.
Oh, sure.
That was an eye-opening film for me. One of my favorite movies of all time, because it was a great movie. I mean, I love just the darkness of that story was amazing. And just a little background here. The first drive, my parents took me to see The Exorcist in a drive-in when I was like a kid. Like
I saw The Exorcist as a kid too.
Yeah, like some young I'm like, what? So that explains a lot about my, I think my proclivities in adulthood, So anyway, just, I watched, I must have been in my early teens when I watched Cruising on VHS. And I was like, suddenly things started making sense to me. Like, oh, okay. Like, oh, these guys look cool, man. They got these like leather jackets. Because I was into the Ramones, maybe, and
sure.
Rob Halford, certainly I had a poster of Judas Priest in my bedroom. Rob Halford, leather jacket, bare chest, hat, riding crop, Harley Davidson, and I was like, wow, these guys are dressed like Rob Halford and like Joey Ramone. So it's like, but then I started seeing that was like a whole other scene, and I was like, well, okay, it sort of made sense to me, and I became more aware of that. And one of the things, like, we're talking about hyper masculinity, and I was also really into Conan the Barbarian, like right around the same time. So there's a very, very strong parallel between Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian and the way he's portrayed in comic books and a Tom of Finland drawing.
Yeah, I think one of the first, this is so embarrassing, but I'm going to tell you anyway, I think one of the first times I was attracted to a man was the Beastmaster.
Okay.
In the 80s. And that's certainly, now it doesn't seem that hyper masculine, but at the time, like you're saying, a barbarian, like, like long hair and muscles and, from the wild. And, yeah, so it seems so ridiculous all these years later, but I think that we're so much more aware of, queer culture and queer imagery that certainly when you're a kid and like pre-internet, access to information and images was really hard.
Yeah, definitely.
Like you would hear about something and then you'd hear about a band and it would take you 2-3 months before you found someone who had a tape to tape it from, or you found it at a store. And I think it's the same thing. And now I look back at, Freddie Mercury or Boy George or George Michael, and all people who I didn't read as gay, even as a gay person coming up.
Yeah, looking back though, especially, like George Michael and Freddie Mercury for sure, Maybe, and not even in the beginning, because they're pretty glammy, Queen.
Yeah.
And the name Queen.
Of course, it seems so obvious,
right.
But it really didn't feel that way at the time. Like it really didn't, and I think that it was also just a time of really outlandish. That from I guess the mid '70s to the mid '80s, it was just a time of so many outlandish looks, not even just for musicians, but professional wrestlers and these outlandish things that it kind of blurs that line where nothing stands out as much. Everyone looks kind of crazy. Everyone has this really over the top look. Whether even in hip hop, they're wearing furs and bright colors and leathers. Like everyone at that time, was outlandish.
So now the big question, and we can build a sort of theorem around this, is that hyper masculine image inherently gay?
I would say yes, because I think if you fetishize and obsess over like the look of an, quote unquote ideal man so much and picture it, it means you appreciate, the male body and the male physique. Whether or not that makes you want to have homosexual sex, I think is really different from it being gay imagery. I think there's a lot of things if I think being gay and being homosexual are two different things. I do. I always tell people when they're like, "Oh, is it a choice?" or anyone brings that up, I'm like, I think the homosexual part of it is not a choice. If you're born wanting to sleep with people of the same sex, that's just who you are. Now, the gay part of it, that's the part that connects you to a history of other people, to a history of art and music and a community and a lineage. You have to choose that. You can deny it. You'll always want to have, sex with people of the same gender, but you don't have to claim everything else around it. You can be in total denial, and this world is full of people
I know
like that.
Personally, so
yeah,
for sure.
Full of people like that. So I would say, is it inherently homosexual? I don't know, but it's, fetishizing the body, and making an ideal male body. When you think about even the people in the Renaissance who did it, statues of David, those are gay people. That's historically the people who have done that have been gay people.
Now, one of the things that I'm quite fascinated with Rome and Greece and the mythologies and all that sort of stuff, and I like to challenge the idea that, like, I think back then, before we had like a monotheistic religious practice in place, that those kind of pagan cultures probably didn't really, to them, I don't think it even mattered if it was like, I think they were free to go and do whatever they wanted to.
Yeah, well, there's it expressed itself in a lot of different ways in the ancient world. Like certainly in ancient Greece and Rome, there's times when soldiers would have another male companion who was younger. Right. But that was, while you were at war. And then there were certain things around it. And there's tribes in Africa where there's relationships between young men and older men. And it seems as a mentorship in a way. But it's homosexual sex. It's just viewed very differently. It's really hard to put like our contemporary lens of what we think a queer person is on another time and culture, because it was totally different to them. So that's why I agree with you. It's like they didn't see it as gay.
Well, I think it's a Christian thing, because in Thailand it's they have they're very permissive in Thailand with how people express themselves sexually, and it's not a Christian culture. They're Buddhists, for the most part.
Yeah, no, for sure. But I mean, but the sad part is, even in Thailand, trans people are marginalized. So there are things that are universal in terms of the opportunity and the access. Like, I don't think anywhere in this world does a queer person have access to the same things that a straight person does.
Do you think that in like a place like Thailand, that it has a lot more to do with like sexual, tourism, sex tourism? Because a lot of Falang go there to get their freak flag, fly their freak flag, and then come back to whatever, Europe or the United States or Canada or wherever they're from, But I think that like maybe in that culture, if it were just kind of left sort of to do its own thing without that weird Christian bent, these like weird European Christians coming over there, I think that sort of persecution wouldn't really exist, really.
Yeah, I really think that, the same in, with Native Americans or, pre-colonial Africa, that you would see it expressed in many different ways, but you would absolutely see open sex between people of the same gender. Like I said, it might be viewed as a mentorship. It might be viewed as, a trans person might be two-spirited. It'll have a different expression in the culture, but at its core, it's still, that kind of relationship, that kind of an identity.
So now, a big hot topic of these last few years, and something that I personally think cost us the election, us meaning Democrats, which technically I registered as a Democrat specifically to vote in the primaries in the last couple of years. I've for most of my life I've been an independent, and but this all the gender politics and kind of pronouns and all this other stuff. It's like, I feel like just from coming from me, like my perspective on it, I just want people to be happy, basically, and I support whatever choices people make, but to kind of be like chastised for not knowing what someone prefers to be called.
Yeah, well, no, I get that, and I understand that people might feel that way, but I think it's pretty easy, just to ask people what they'd be called. I'm perfectly happy to call you whatever you want. If I don't have any reason to disrespect you, I wouldn't. In terms of it being a divisive thing, I think this administration has manipulated the dialogue and exploited, the trans community to their benefit. And really use this arbitrary thing where there's so many businesses in this country where everyone uses the same bathroom. I've worked in tons of offices where everybody uses the same bathroom, and that's not a controversial thing. It was brought up to exploit them and to put the fear of people in them, and to really truly misinform people about the trans community and what that means, because it's an umbrella term. It means a lot of different things. It's a range of things. And when it comes to pronouns, there's friction between different generations of queer people, because people, I guess, are in their 20s now, have had the benefit, many of them, of a higher education and of learning from scholarship about queer people that older generations didn't. So someone like me, I learned about it out on the streets. I got called a faggot on the streets. People threw a bottle at me on the streets. I've been, many times, I've been called a million things. So I feel like I have the right to say them and reclaim them in whichever way I want to, because I live this life. I've suffered this persecution. In some ways, I made it safer for you, just like people made it safer for me. So you don't get to police me or tell me about my experience. But I do think that that's just part of evolution and evolving as a people, that, language evolves. Language isn't a static thing. And I think the same thing with identity, and that ultimately it doesn't, I don't think it's that hard to ask someone, how do you like to be referred at? And they're like, they, there. And I think that if you make the mistake and slip and misgender someone, if you're honest and you're just like, oh, I'm sorry, and just correct yourself and keep moving. In my experience, people appreciate that you're, just making that effort and asking them directly. I work with a lot of trans artists, and I've worked with people who've transitioned years after I knew them. So I was very used to referring them a certain way, and then it's changed, and it's a learning curve. It's not easy for anyone. I really think it's the intention behind it, and that if you're an open person trying to do your best, people are going to read that on you.
Yeah, personally, I've never had any, I never had any friction with anybody, but with all the articles you read about everything, it's just,
of course,
it builds a narrative, just like a lot of things.
Yeah, and that's on purpose, though. You have to, have that critical filter. That's like, this is propaganda. There's, I'm not being threatened by these people. How are we being threatened by the most vulnerable community in this country? There is no one in this country more vulnerable than a trans person of color. That is the most vulnerable community in our country. How can they possibly threaten you?
That's a good point, and you could go on to, like, for example, my parents. I love them dearly, but we differ on so many fundamental things. So when I'm spending time with my family, the news is on, and they're being bombarded by all this narrative, which, a lot of it is, there's someone's take on something, yet there's no visible proof that any of these things really exist, so being like critical of some of the things that you read and hear, and perspective, and being aware that you're being manipulated is something that slips by a lot of people, you know what I mean? And so applying that logic to the situation is something that more people should do, really, because I'm guilty of it too. I read some article, someone fucking tags me in Facebook or whatever, and it's like, oh, and you feel outraged, and oh wow, this is, someone's gonna like call me this thing or whatever because I don't have this, like, I don't agree with one. But the thing is, it's all part of a narrative that either the left or the right is trying to fucking develop for their own agendas.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's important for us to connect with each other face to face and in person, and to create spaces for dialogue, and where all kinds of people feel comfortable hanging out together.
Yeah.
Like you said, that's always been the benefit of being in New York City. I certainly, when I DJ or put on parties, I put a lot of effort into that. Of, is this inclusive? Are people going to be here? Because you can't read about something; you need to live it.
Yeah, totally. And that's like one of the biggest problems. Like with young people these days, a lot of them don't even leave the house, man. It's like when I was a kid, I wanted to, play. I wanted to ride my bike. I wanted to go out and explore the world. And get into trouble, and go places I wasn't supposed to go to, see people I wasn't supposed to see.
Of course.
You know, but like, I see, you know, there's different family members I have that they have, you know, kids who are growing up, and they just want to stay home and fuck around with their phones, you know. So everything that they're getting is almost like this almost a virtual reality, like a simulation of the world that they're taking in through this device, be it an iPhone or an iPad or their computer. So it's like this once removed simulation of the world without actually going out there and meeting any of these people.
Yeah, where it's vicarious. And that's what I mean. It's really easy to give an opinion, you know, and type it into your phone and then put it down and keep watching it. It's a television show. It's not as easy to give that opinion to someone's face who's going to answer you back in that moment, who has a perspective. And you kind of what we were saying before about people from different regions of the country. But I just think that that's the only answers for us to be around each other and talk to each other, because, you know, to those people, if they think that they're not interacting with, you know, gay, lesbian, and trans people on a regular basis, they're very wrong. It's impossible in this country unless you live in a very isolated place where you see very few people. It's like you're around us.
That's kind of the American way, though, being like this, you know, the United States being isolated from the rest of the world too. It's sort of this like, it's really ironic in a way, because, you know, Americans like to think of themselves as these kind of like, you know, desperado pioneers pushing the border westward, but the reality is that if you travel to Europe, all the countries are right next to each other. You know, you got Spain, Italy, Greece, Germany, Slovenia, like Belgium. They're all there, and people are constantly going across the borders. You know, traveling, mixing. Yeah. Everyone knows how to speak 15 languages, and the different cultures commingle. But over here, we're just fucking Americans, man, really, for the most part, you know, and the only influence that we have is like from immigrants coming in. And that's another irony is our fear of fucking immigrants in this country. I want to know, you know, I just want to know what the hell Trump has against Mexican people, really, you know?
I don't even know if it's that deep. I don't even know if he has any deep thoughts about Mexican people or has ever interacted in any meaningful way with Mexican people. I would certainly doubt that. I just think that, you know, he's someone who's the face of something, and that the brains is someone else behind it, and they feed him a narrative that he repeats, and he's happy just to see his face everywhere every day. And that's all he wants. That's not deeper than that with him, that he just, you know, wants celebrity like he's wanted his whole life. I mean, he showed us who he is decades ago. I don't think that's different. You know, when you're from New York, I'm like, he's been a joke since I was a child, literally. He's been a joke to me and people in this area for 30 something years.
Oh, definitely. You know, and I mean, most recently said there was some like executive order, because like right now, if you're listening to this podcast in the month of June, we're experiencing, you know, this horrible, you know, what I'm looking at is infringement of human rights with Mexican immigrants being separated from their families. And so you were saying that just in the last few hours, there was some sort of development.
Yeah, it seems like, of course, that he's going to sign an executive order to stop that now. But, you know, the narrative with him is he's going to create a problem, blame it on someone else, then pretend like he's the one who fixed it and take the credit. But, you know, what you were talking about infringement on human rights, the word I would use for it is terrorism. And it's already mission accomplished. In my heart of hearts, I really think that what this administration wanted is for the world to see images of children in cages, for them to know that that's what's going to happen to you here, and for people throughout all of Latin America to be horrified by it, and for them to think twice about trying it. That's terrorism. That's propaganda. That's how terrorism works. And even if he reverses it now, those images are out there. The damage is done. Like, that fear is there. People are going to think twice. And the sad thing is, I'm sure there's people who are all for it, you know, knowing that reason.
I know people that are all for it.
I sure as fuck don't. And if I do know you and you're all for it, don't tell me unless you want to get slapped.
Man. I hate to tell you, but there are family members I have that think that that's a good idea. And, you know, like I said.
You know, I'm an illegal immigrant, too. Not just a queer person. I came here illegally in 1984 with my mom, and I was here illegally for 11 years. You know, moved here only speaking Spanish. And, you know, again, it's the vulnerable people in this in our society are always the ones who are going to pay the heaviest price. And, you know, in my case, I came from Spain, and even then it was very difficult, but that's different than, you know, people of color who come from other parts, and they're always going to pay the price first. Trans people, people with no money, people of color, that's who's really paying the price of our administration. And if you don't like those kind of people, of course you're all for it.
It blows my mind. I mean, there are family members I have, and my family is primarily an immigrant family. My mom's first generation American. Like, that side of the family comes from Italy. My dad's side of the family has been here a little bit longer, but when the Irish came off the boat, they just put him to war. You know, they just drafted him into the army and sent him to fight for a civil war, basically, with something they have nothing to do with. So immigrants are being exploited by this country since the beginning of the country, really.
Oh, of course. I mean, we live in a country that founded on exploitation, and capitalism requires exploitation, or it doesn't work. The only way capitalism works is for the people on top to exploit the ones on the bottom. That's not theory or controversial opinion. That's how it works. And, you know, our country was built on on slavery and the exploitation of anyone possible.
One of the the thing that, you know, related to this is, anyone who supports, we should take these kids from their family. Okay. All right. If you're that heartless of a human being, let me appeal to the more pragmatic side. Who the hell is going to pay for care for these kids? You have to put them in a cage somewhere. You have to feed them, give them medical attention, clothe them. And that's all taxpayer dollars that are being spent on that. So on that purely draconian sort of mindset, wouldn't you rather have their families take care of them as opposed to the burden of that? I just don't understand. None of it makes any sense.
No, it doesn't make sense, because everybody knows that immigrants actually are far less likely to commit crimes because they're scared of being deported, and that they all work. My parents worked like crazy. You know, no one comes to, the idea of the welfare queen in this country is greatly exaggerated. The welfare queen is a white man that works at a bank. That's who's getting the welfare money. It's not someone who's, selling a couple Pampers to make a couple extra dollars for some Lucy's. And, I just think there's a lot of misrepresentation of the same people in our country because it's convenient to misrepresent them. And immigrants is just an easy target. Our entire food supply depends on them. It would be crazy. We could never get rid of them. Our country would collapse in so many ways, but no one's going to tell you that. Even though it's the truth, this administration's never going to, give you the black and white.
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing that seems painfully obvious to me is that, okay, you have a problem with immigrants illegally entering the country. It's why not make them citizens? Why not have them some
path to citizenship.
Some path to citizenship presented to them so that they can you can start taxing them.
Yeah. I'm kind of a hippie too, to be honest. As much as I want to say that, there's part of me when I think about immigration that's just thinks about how crazy just that idea is. It's of how offended they are. I'm are you going to ask a Canadian goose for papers whenever flies over the border? We're animals on the same planet.
Well, I mean, if you look at, all right.
And also, one thing I want to say about the wall is, if it ever happens, I hope it protects Mexicans from Americans, because no one's ever talking about all the Americans that cross over to Juarez and to Tijuana for prostitution, for access to drugs, for prescriptions that they don't want, and they go there and they get trashed, and, they sex tourism there too, and then they cross back over the border. What about protecting those people? It's there's people in Mexico who are in danger from Americans on the border as well, in real danger.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I feel like the whole world is in danger of Americans. You ever see Americans over abroad in Europe? Americans and British people in Europe are the worst, straight up. Yeah. We had a layover in Amsterdam one time, and it was a 12-hour layover, and we left. Obviously, I wasn't going to sit in the airport for 12 hours, so we went into the city, and we're just, hanging around, getting falafels, going to the red light district, whatever. And I was just oh, obviously, you can see the Americans and the British people, because they're the ones who are making the most fucking noise. They're the ones who are the drunkest on the street, and they're the ones who are making the biggest ruckus. And I was just this is why everyone hates the Americans.
Yeah, that's a
just,
tourist thing too. But certainly, you know, my family's from Barcelona, and I definitely see plenty of drunk British and German and Dutch people going crazy, doing things they would never do in their own country.
That's true, yeah.
On the street in Spain. But I guess maybe that's why, because you're not in your own country. Lord knows I know Spanish people act crazy, so.
Man, when I'm overseas, I just like, I try not to fucking even, I just keep to myself.
But at the same time, I'm so proud to be from here. You know, I almost feel like growing up in the New York area is like winning the lottery. It's one of the best things that can ever happen to you, of being exposed to all different kinds of people your whole life and knowing so much about so many things inherently, just from walking the street or taking the train and knowing that. And I, you know, growing up, you always think about what you don't have, but I really appreciate that. And I wish that for other people. And I guess I credit it with not really feeling that way. So I've always, you know, lived around different Muslim communities, Middle Eastern immigrants and Black Muslims. And, you know, there are always, you know, immigrants, like recent immigrants from Ireland and Poland when I was growing up, just like there were from all of Latin America. And it's not, I think that most people who have this idea of the other as this threat, it's an imagined one, because they've never met that person. They've never met one. I have this conversation with, you know, people in my extended family or that I know from other places where they're like, well, aren't you, you know, you're from New York. Aren't you scared of terrorism? And you're gay. Aren't you scared you're going to get thrown off a roof? I'm like, I'm scared of Mike Pence. Yeah. No one's throwing me off a New York roof for being gay. You know, like that's just not how the world works. I'm not scared of that. I'm scared of exactly what's going on, of their making discrimination against me legal.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. It's really funny that you mentioned, you know, being, you know, terrorism and living in New York. Cause obviously, you know, not the Twin Towers were, you know, the fucking tragedy that happened back in, you know, it's almost 20 years ago at this point. And I still, even in the midst of all that, I still never really felt like fear or animosity towards like Muslims or any of this sort of stuff.
No, I actually think a lot of people from here felt it towards our country and was like, you did this to us. Because as much as, you know, quote unquote, you know, patriots or everyone hates New York on the right until it's time to bring up 9/11 and exploit it for your convenience. But it made me really suspicious of even more suspicious rather of our government. And you know, why did you do that? And then you see this images of George Bush reading a children's book, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's when I was, you know, scared for my life on the street and I know what was happening, trying to find a way home. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, that was, you know, I think I was working in New Jersey at the time, and like a lot of the people I'm an engineer, or I was an engineer at that point, so like my boss was Turkish Muslim. A lot of my coworkers were Muslims, you know, from various different countries, Jordan, you know, and I noticed that they started feeling uncomfortable, and you know, because of just the rhetoric that was being put out there about Islam, and because prior to 9/11, no one really thought about the Middle East. I mean, it was always this kind of thing, like, okay, yeah, oil, the Middle East, Islam, but that was a real turning point in the way that people that were, you know, from that part of the world were viewed, I think, in this country.
Yeah, well, you know, I guess us being attacked here definitely heightened it. But even during the first Iraq war, I guess in like 91, I had Iraqi kids that I went to school with. And I remember the teachers having to speak to everyone of, you know, don't say anything bad to them, don't say anything against them, don't do that. But that still felt kind of new. And then that first World Trade Center bomb, I think it was like 93. And but yeah, that changed the dialogue completely. I don't think people had this fear of terrorism, period. Even though, you know, we had seen plenty of terrorism. You know, Oklahoma City was in the 90s and things like that.
Yeah, you know, and yeah, I don't know, it's a totally different landscape post 9/11.
Oh, yeah, the culture of fear. Yeah. That's what happened to the rest of the world. Everyone's like, oh, 9/11 happened to everybody. I'm like, well, 9/11 happened to people in New York, but everything that came after happened to the whole world. We really live in this culture of fear, and I think we're still at a fever pitch of it, and that's what makes, you know, Donald Trump possible.
So to change the subject drastically, did you go to any of the Misfits shows?
You know, I feel like the Misfits got nerve charging the people of New Jersey $300 to be in front of them. I'm like, my first Misfits tape was like a tape of a tape of a tape passed down from, Jersey punk legacies. And so Misfits is as close to religion as I get in some ways. And I really, it was 2 blocks from my house in Newark. So I definitely hung out outside of it, but I just couldn't justify the price of it. And I didn't think it would, when I really thought about it objectively, I didn't know if it would be that exciting to me, because I feel like I've seen Danzig sing Misfit songs many times in my life, a lot of times, and I really just want his voice to be there. I don't really care about Jerry Only, and maybe that's sacrilege, but I just don't. No, I just need Glenn singing the songs, and no matter who's playing it, if they're doing a decent job and his voice sounds good that day, like I'm good.
I tend to agree with you on that, because I think that like a lot of times these like reunion type money grabs that happen is like a nostalgia trip for a lot of people. And I mean, the Misfits were like a time and a place, man. And I mean, even Mike Hill is too young to have actually seen the Misfits in their prime, in their heyday. And I think that if you missed it first time around, that's it. You don't really get a chance to catch it. So seeing Glenn a couple of years ago, they did those Legacy tour, and he had Doyle up there, and they did Sam Haines songs, and that was enough for me. But knowing how bad of a guitar player Jerry Only is, like, I don't think I really needed to see that. You know what I'm trying to say? I mean, I didn't go either, so.
Yeah, no, and also the fact that it's in an arena.
Yeah,
totally.
I'm
like, I don't know if I want to see that in an arena, because I don't even see Danzig in an arena. I usually see him at a club. I love to see him in Jersey at the Starland Ballroom. Every few years, he'll do like a homecoming show around Christmas.
Yeah. Yep.
And he usually does Sam Haines and Misfits songs at those too. And they're crazy. And they're just so much fun that I can't imagine. Misfits isn't the kind of band I want to see with this big production. You know what I mean? It'd be the same thing as if, Lux was still here. You wouldn't want to see the Cramps at the Garden. How would that be fun?
No, that wouldn't be fun at all. It would be like so far away.
So disconnected, exactly.
Watching
That's
it on
something to
an
be
LED screen,
in someone's face. Yeah, you want someone's face.
Now, Glenn is a complicated guy too.
I'll tell you something about that I love to tell people, because that there's those Henry and Glenn comic books that imagine the love life of Henry Rollins and Glenn Danzig, and everyone's like, oh, Glenn would never like this, and Glenn Danzig's homophobic, this or that. I don't believe it. One, I've never seen anything to substantiate that, and two, one of those shows at Starland Ballroom, the 2 people I was with, our car had broke down, and we needed someone from security to help us. Sure. And they were like, just wait for it to be over. And I guess they told the band, and they asked us to come backstage and say hi to us. And I was with my best friend, who's trans, and another one of my close friends who's a black woman, and he had this face of joy. You could tell that he was not expecting us to come through the door and do that, and stayed and spoke to us, and I could just see how happy he was. I'm like, I can tell you think this is really cool that we're here seeing you, because there's no one else in this club we stood out,
Sure.
And I always just go back to that, where I'm like, you can't fake that. When someone's first impression of you, the look on their face, I think tells you everything.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, just a lot of people have ideas, and one of the things about those comics that the problem I have with those comics is that I don't know what the motivations were, but it's like there's somehow like the fact, if they were gay, right, that there is some kind of diminishing of them, and I don't agree with that. I think that if Glenn or Henry were both gay, that would be it's a sort of completely irrelevant thing to me and my appreciation of like what they've done creatively, nor would it change my opinion of them as men or whatever, and I just thought it was like a little juvenile.
Yeah, but I think it goes back to what we were talking about, hyper masculinity. They both have these hyper masculine images that I don't think it was deeper than someone just thinking it was funny. Of people write fan fiction and do those things. They're like, here are these 2 really tough guys. Imagine them as like just boyfriends who go grocery shopping together and domesticate these wild, rock and roll men and paint them in these really, kind of mundane queer life situations. But I know what you mean. I don't think I think it's funny, but it's not the best thing ever, and it definitely wouldn't change my opinion.
I just thought they weren't good comics either.
I'll tell you something. kind of related to what you were just saying, because I was about to say that it wouldn't change my opinion of them if one of them came out, but it would. I don't have no reason to believe either one of them's gay, but it would mean a lot to me, because when I was growing up, I didn't really have out queer musicians to look up to. No one, even Boy George wasn't out at that time in the early 80s. So I didn't understand it about me, but I was coming to an understanding, and I had no one to look up to. And I think that's so great that kids now have so many out people, so many out musicians in different ways as role models, because it's when you don't see yourself reflected in the world anywhere, it's so isolating, and you wonder to yourself if you're ever going to find it or how fucked up you are if it's really that rare. And as much as we can talk about the Buzzcocks and certainly, the Bags and the Germs, have been queer people in punk and this music. To this day, so many of our icons are queer people, and they're closeted. That makes me sad, particularly in metal and hard rock music. You see that a lot in hip hop. And I hope that we see the end of that day. I would love to see a lot of out people making extreme music and having just a general audience, not being a fringe thing that only other queer people support.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely gay out players in extreme music, but not Rob Halford obviously was like the biggest icon out of all, really. And there's definitely, I remember there was a whatever prehistoric time that was in the late 80s, there was like this kind of like backlash to that, which I believe wouldn't exist today though. Because obviously Judas Priest goes out and plays these like...
I want to believe that, Mike, but why do you think so many of the icons that we have... Because we have hard rock icons and metal icons that are gay and still closeted or queer. Why do you think that they don't? Because I always think the only reason not to do it is you don't want to threaten your fan base. You don't want to kind of risk your fame and your legacy, Because if you've gone this far and you've built something and you didn't do it at the beginning...
That's an interesting question, and which I think about that too, but it's hard for me to answer that because I don't really have the hang up about that stuff. Like I'm not hung up about sexuality, and if I was gay, I would be out, or I'd like to believe that I would, and I don't really, I can see being uncomfortable with it, being involved in like such a macho world of like extreme music where there's this real sort of brutal exterior, but the first tier of concern I would have would be just friends and family, which is what everyone else has to deal with, and then the larger persona of what other people would think. But I think if I was able to overcome the hurdle of my friends and family, then the other stuff would fall in line with that. You know what I mean? Like I don't think that, but I think that's speaking for me. But if I was successful and I had fans and whatever, then that might be a concern. Then you might have like someone in your ear being like, "Hey."
But even if not though, I think a lot of people their concern starts when they're trying to be successful, and they still to this day think, "Oh, this is going to hold me back, or this is going to ghettoize me." Where I won't get these other opportunities. Everything I do will always be preceded by, like gay musician this or trans musician that, and it'll always be this qualifier before everything else that you've done or that you're putting out in the world.
Yeah, I mean that's once again like that's an interesting question, because I do believe, having seen many different crowds across the country and overseas, that probably homophobia is alive and well, and that it did have I like to believe that fans of metal are more open-minded in some ways, but then again, like I've been on some tours where I definitely believe that's not the case.
Well, I was going to ask you if if you've witnessed it or been around homophobia and transphobia.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We had a guy actually in the band. I'm not going to name any names, but who was a fill-in guy that did some touring with us last year, who would drop those terms which I don't like to use, referring to gay people, and it was, but it wasn't done like it was done in a hurtful way,
right?
What I mean, so it made me believe that this guy has unresolved issues with that sort of expression, and he's like comfortable saying that, and I thought that wasn't very cool, really.
Yeah, and in turn, that's why I think that if those people realize that so many of the records that they, you know, love or bands they go see have queer people in them, I wonder if they would still feel that way, which is another reason for artists to come out. It's not just so other queer kids can kind of, you know, see you and look up to you and feel courage vicariously through you, but also so other people can realize that we're, you know, kind of in every scene, always have been, and even records that are made by heterosexual people are still super queer. That, like the cornerstones of our music. You know, you think like the New York Dolls. They might all be heterosexual men, but no one's gonna ever tell me the Dolls aren't a queer band. You listen to a song like Jet Boy, that's a queer rock and roll song. Or you throw out like Lou Reed or David Bowie or any of that. But it goes more than that. I think when you go to extreme, when you go into extreme music and any kind of underground, you think about Christian Death and Roz Williams. That's not a straight person, you know.
No, definitely not.
And even Lux Interior, as much as with Ivy, I don't think you could describe him as straight. He's someone who loved to wear women's clothing and makeup and cat suits and explore kink and present himself really feminine, almost girly, and you know, be a plaything for her. And that's certainly all taken from queer culture and used that way. And I think that's what made them so cool and feel so dangerous and unpredictable. And that's why no matter how many, you know, psychobilly or punk bands that sound like that come out, nothing ever feels like the Cramps does, because there's always that macho part of it. They don't get that part of it, the anything goes sexuality of the Cramps.
Yeah, that's the thing about a lot of you know, like rockabilly dudes wearing eyeliner and like, but still sort of not being comfortable with that, being influenced by, you know, a queer or sort of, you know,
or even realizing it,
or even
you know, like
exactly.
I think people are really just don't have that conversation with themselves. I'm like, don't fool yourself. Like, this is what that is, and it's okay to think it looks cool, and it's okay to think it sounds cool. You know, that has nothing to do with who you want to, you know, who you want to fuck later.
One thing I got to keep going back to this thing of you know, masculinity and just because like I've had reflections on this over the last, say, 10 years or so about definitely in our culture it's sort of people, they simplify it and reduce masculinity in a lot of ways to just one particular thing. Like if you like are into being healthy, strong, that you're a meathead. You know what I mean? That you can't be anything but somebody who just spends the whole day doing deadlifts or like punching a heavy bag or something like that. You can only be that one thing. You can't be intellectual. You can't be creative. You can't be sensitive. You can't be any of these things. And I just feel like there's like I'm not trying to get into this manosphere bullshit that I hear being thrown around about like how white men have it so tough. But it's like, I do think that is misunderstood a lot of times and simplified by people. Absolutely.
And I agree with you. But I also think, you know, some of the people who partake in it simplify it. But masculinity, like femininity, is a range of things, and it has so many different expressions, and they're all valid, as is anything that's in between them. You know, it's an umbrella term. You know, and people are always policing each other. That I think that's the real problem. That there's always this, and it's the same thing with, you know, like in any underground, where there's people going to tell you what the mores are and what the rules are, and that you're not following them. But most of us aren't this archetype. You might look like it might seem like you are, but we're these complex people, and it's perfectly, you know, normal for someone to want to go to the gym and be healthy and take care of themselves and be a sensitive person. And someone can, you know, really love gardening and be a real asshole.
That's true. Yeah. Just because you're going.
It's just, you know what I mean? It's almost like these 80s movies, like The Breakfast Club, where everyone has this role and they play that role 100%. Yep. And real people aren't that way. And I think the conversation around masculinity is just really needs to be kind of fine-tuned to the part of it that's about the toxic aspects of it. You know, the need to dominate or these other things. But they kind of go hand in hand. We were talking before about hyper masculinity, but there's something really beautiful about that. When you see this, you know, idealized man or do that, or you see someone exercising or a gym, I don't know. There's just something that's kind of, you know, it's just so on purpose and curated that way that it's also not rough around the edges. It's not that. It might look really masculine, but it's not tough at the same time. Like these things kind of have intersections, as opposed to there being like, this is masculine, anything that's like this is not.
Yeah, no, totally. I agree with that. You know, but I guess the point I was trying to make is just because you go to a yoga class doesn't give you a pass to be a total asshole to people. You know what I mean?
No, there's plenty of people going to yoga class who are assholes. Like,
yeah.
What does that have to do with anything? There's a lot of people who feel really enlightened but aren't doing anything impacting the real world. You know, I'm glad you can do whatever pose and that you meditated and drank some tea. Hooray for you. You know, but what's that doing for the collective good? Do you really believe in those ideas? Are you really doing something I hate yoga because I'm not someone who can stay still and move around, but I'm like a peaceful person. And in terms of like, you know, being aware of yourself and of trying to connect in a deeper way with nature, those things, that's fascinating to me. I don't think that anyone has the exclusive rights to any of that. And, that's the punk thing, though, right? It's who's anyone else to tell you what you should and shouldn't be doing?
So you have a DJ show coming up next week.
I do. Berlin on 2nd and A at 11 p.m. on Thursday the 28th. And it's, you know, kind of anything goes rock and roll party. There'll be garage and psychobilly and, you know, punk and post-punk and Motown records. And we have a really cool kind of punkish drag queen called Bella Noche, who's going to be doing a couple performances through the night. And the idea is to, you know, bring different people together who love underground music and just hang out and for everyone to feel welcome, and it's free. You know, which is really important to me too, to create these free spaces where we can kind of, you know, share stuff with each other and play records. And I always kind of try to look at DJ sets like the Olympics of like how many things within, you know, the underground framework can I play that bring people together, that represent different aspects of people. And, you know, I got high hopes, so we're hoping to take it monthly.
Awesome.
So.
Yeah, that's cool, man. Do a monthly gig like that. I've always been curious about, you know, DJing and stuff. And like, do you start out with sort of like a roadmap of what songs you're going to play, or is everything, you know, planned out from the beginning, or are you doing it on the fly, or what's the story?
I think a lot about the night and kind of the location. One thing is if it's a place that's more calm and you can kind of go on your own trip, then I'll really plan it out. But if it's meant for people to dance or a more lively thing, I try to bring a wide range of things so I could read the room and see what people are reacting to. So, if, you know, at the moment, as the crowd is like older or younger or, you know, dominated by people, and I really kind of just come up with this concept. Like I told you, you know, I'm obviously not going to play modern records or, you know, country music really, or these things. It's going to be underground music, you know, goth and punk and post-punk and all that. But that's big umbrella terms. So bring stuff from different generations and different scenes and that. And what's really fun to me is to draw the connections, you know, to try and segue between all these things as seamlessly as possible, but be like, oh, you know, I played 6 really different types of music in 2 hours.
That's awesome, because I've been doing this thing for Gimme Radio recently. It's like essentially a DJ set, really. It's about an hour of music, and, you know, it's fun, man. And I try to build these narratives with, like, the songs where I kind of, like, you know, come up with a theme maybe, and I'll start with one song and then like, all right, where do I go from here, and connect it, like there'll be like some connection, even if it's not an obvious thing. It might be just like an emotion or something, or this is like, you know, like I'll take like a Fields of the Nephilim song, like maybe from like the Zune record or something, and then I'll put that next to like, you know, like a Ministry track or something like that. You know what I mean? And then from Ministry, I might go to like Godflesh. From Godflesh, I might go to like Napalm Death, and from, you know, stuff like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's fun because, you know, as much as everyone has access to the history of music now, there's really nothing that's curatorial.
Yeah.
And when you've had, you know, luck like me, and you have to experience a lot of things in person and be around scenes for a really long time and taking part in them, contributing to them, you bring authenticity. A Spotify playlist is never going to bring that. You're going to draw those connections and dig up those things that an algorithm will never do.
True. That's
and
true.
And also I think that it's a really generous thing that it's underground culture. No one is from the outside is going to take care of it, preserve it, or see that it's written down accurately. So, you know, DJ sets from someone like you is also an oral history of things.
That's true. Yeah, that's a good point.
So I always look at that too. I'm like, I'm conserving something. It's really easy to partake in this narrative of New York is over and everyone's rich and all those things. And I get that. I feel that way too. I've been here a long time, but for me, the only answer is to make your own things, create your own spaces, start your own parties, make your own songs. And if you feel like something was better back in the day, try to, capture that energy now and in a way that makes sense for this moment, and conserve it and keep it alive. Don't sit home complaining, because I can't. I was driving myself crazy a few years ago with nostalgia.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I really need to get out there and start doing new things and, preserving this, because it's going to make me bitter.
Actually, yeah, when I'm not doing something, then the demons and the dark thoughts start coming into my head, and then the cunty side of my personality comes out, and I start complaining, and it's like, yeah, the only remedy to that is to actually go out and do something.
And support things too, because when you see someone, don't sit home watching Netflix. When you see someone, you're like, oh, that looks cool. You have to make that effort and go out. It's, our scenes are self-sustaining, and in any city, but certainly in New York, it's threatened. In Manhattan, there's not many rock and roll bars left. There's not many venues. So if you don't support what's around, you kind of don't have a right to complain.
So once again, the time and place.
Yes. So it's at Berlin at 11 p.m. on June 28th. That's next Thursday. And that's 2nd and A. And down in the basement under 2A, the bar. And it's, going to be a rock and roll good time, good music for bad people.
Hell yeah, man. And I know a lot of you guys are in the tri-state area. So if you got nothing to do, you want to get into some trouble on a Thursday night, come on out. I'll be there. And once again, Aleix, thanks a lot for spending time with us, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much. It's, I really appreciate the chance to have this conversation. So.
And thank you for listening. Take care.
Where's the logic in her dreams? Love is always at a distance. On the street, at the club. She sits. She smokes. She vanishes. The nightlight got her all choked up. She couldn't really run away. She does nothing. She stands. She does nothing. She vanishes. She blames them all. She blames herself. Look out on the beach. There's a knife in her hand. And a bag in her knees. She stabs the sand. Behind the cliff. She burns at the stake. She signals the message. Through the flames. 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 Can she die? She cannot. Can she die? She's got me. Where can I go? She's got she. Where can she run? She's got me. Where can I go? She's got she. Where can she run? She saves me. She does nothing. She buys in. She saves me. She does nothing. She buys in. She saves me. She does nothing. She buys in. She saves me. She does nothing.
It's funny. No one's actually been able to tell you exactly. Okay, you have, 2,000 subscribers on iTunes, but they can tell you how many times people will listen to it, and for how long,
Okay.
and that sort of stuff. So there's like a weird, the data for reporting stuff to get potential sponsors and whatnot.
Oh yeah. So you don't have an idea of the subscribers you have on iTunes?
No, but I can tell that. I know you would think that'd be an easy metric to come by.
Of course.
But either Apple doesn't want to give up that information, or
Assholes.
I don't know why they wouldn't want to be like, hey, you've got this many subscribers. But they'll tell you like how many people listen to it,
Right.
and how long they listen to it for. But who is actually subscribed on iTunes? It's still fairly. But then again, on the host, once again, people like can join. Like the host that I use is called Podbean, right?
Mm-hmm.
as a listener, you can open up an account with Podbean, and then you can search, browse through all the different shows they have and subscribe internally on that platform. So I can go to Podbean and say, okay, how many subscribers through Podbean do I have? But I don't know how many through, Stitcher or
right.
You know what I mean? So
right.
There's so many different outlets, or Google
shit.
Play, or Spot. Like just recently, I got added to Spotify, so it's like.
And did you have to do something for that, or your distributor just started working with them? Like,
well, you had to submit your show to Spotify.
oh, okay.
And then they tell you whether or not they're going to take it. So I mean, I don't know what criteria they have, but so I just.
Because I have noticed some podcasts that aren't on it. That's why I was asking.
Yeah.
That surprises me when you look for it. You're like, what's up with that?
Yeah, the Spotify. The thing about Spotify that's weird, and this is just the same old plantation mentality about major labels and everything. It's like, when music and everything started going digital,
right?
And there's less physical product changing hands. The major labels decided, okay, we're gonna, open up an outlet for people to stream music. Spotify.
Yeah, no, they're partners, and of course they negotiated those deals, and they negotiated them to favor the label.
Yeah,
They
totally.
certainly didn't negotiate them in the artist. And the problem now that Spotify's public is that we're going to start selling those stocks and really reaping the profit of those deals, and none of that is going to get kicked down.
Hell no.
To the people. So, they're saying how they will, but they won't.
Yeah, and it's like, the problem I have with it too, it's like, I mean, as you know from working in the business, it's the royalty rates that you negotiate on a contract. It's like, you're lucky if you get 12%, So that, when I tried to explain this to my guys in the band one time, and I was just like, the royalty means this. It's like, say it's 12%, right? So 12 cents on every dollar earned goes to the band account, okay?
Right. Sure.
But if you spend like 20 grand on recording a record, that every dollar they make, only 12 cents goes to pay that back.
Right.
So that's why they can keep giving you money to make more records, because you might never, or it'll be years before you recoup all that.
Oh, yeah.
So now in the digital world, you're getting screwed just the same way. Mm-hmm. It's the same old thing, except on downloads, and the rate is even lower than what you would get on physical product. So it's like, it's cool, but you're getting. I mean, I see our reports. I mean, we on some of our records we're making money, but it's like such a minuscule amount versus like merchandise and touring and all this other stuff. So it's like, the artist is still getting screwed. The major, the labels are still reaping the rewards, and it's just everyone thought, I guess, that the digital revolution was going to like favor the artist somehow, but it's not really.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird because on the one hand, it did put the means of production like more in your hands than ever, of making a professional quality product at a price that's accessible to more people. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, it's like, what you just said, it's you kind of benefit because you're someone who can tour, who has merch to sell, but someone who made like a bedroom record, electronic record or something that maybe doesn't DJ.
No.
Doesn't have a recognizable face, not going to sell. Before, those 12 inches, those vinyls, those things would sell. Those people have nothing. Like, there's no avenue really for them to make money. So it's really narrowed the field for what you know what I mean? What you can do.
Yeah, and I mean, I know like
Alicia's allergic to Luda. Yeah, and she always wants to be near him. Always.
Okay.
It's fine. Don't worry about it.
Is it okay if she sits?
Yeah.
I probably need that to be a little closer.
Yep.
But one of the other things too, it's like one of the other clients I had that I worked with to produce their show that they were doing was they were involved in the hip hop community, and kids these days, they're just putting stuff right on YouTube. And at least in that realm, if you get, I mean, you need like massive amounts of views to make any money off of ad revenue. But at least in that sense, like that still keeps it like kind of DIY, even though you need like millions to make $1. You need such a huge amount of views of your video. But yeah, I mean, it's like there's always a by the way whenever it comes to music.
Oh, of course.
It's always like, okay, well, now you have all this agency in creating your own media. But by the way, there's this great platform, but it's still taking all the money.
Yeah. No, and even though it's also easier to go direct to consumer, everything's so saturated that it's harder than ever to stand out and to reach people and to capture attention. Everyone's attention is so divided.